So it's only me going solo today for timing complications, essentially. But it was very important that we still gave you a review show because when this league needs stability, when it needs viewership, when it needs kind of this energy, consistency is the best way to provide that electricity. And we'll get into a bit more of that later. But like a lot of these leagues will start with like, oh well, I need a certain NFL, former athlete, or I need a star, facilitator in terms of viewership, in terms of numbers, in terms of like a star. Even like Caitlin Clark, a lot of people will give her a lot of credit for what she did with the women's bracket, in recent times. But Paige Beckers, there was a lot of women. Angel Reese, for example, were a part of that, that South Carolina team. You know, Gino, the head coach of, Connecticut. If you're a big fan of women's basketball, you know these names for a lot longer. Brianna Stewart, and I could go on. But when you have that electricity, you have to, kind of balance out that wave. And that's why, for one, I wanted to do this review show, is just to stay consistent, even though the rest of the gentlemen couldn't join me. I do have kind of a point to make at the end, which I think just so happens to be good timing because it's something that's really passionate for me. But I don't know how the other gentlemen on this podcast, Donnie, Gov, and then Evan, would react. So allowing me to do this kind of solo show will give me a platform to speak on this issue that I think is very important after we do the review. And then if you guys want to turn away, if Gov and Donnie and Evan do want to speak on it, we can bring it up again on Friday because we will be doing a construction show for week 5 of the UFL on Friday night as scheduled as usual. But again, just to stay consistent, that's why I'm here by myself today rolling through, just so we have some consistency. So even though the guys couldn't join me, they are in spirit. So let's get on to this exact lineup. And let me see if I'll pull it up just so you guys can see a bit larger here. So this lineup, we got some things right. I thought the Dempsey play was smart because, again, we talked about it, me, Gov, and Evan and I, because Donnie couldn't join us that night as well, but we talked about how it was a decision point that you had to make in this lineup. If you were playing Dempsey, he was going to open up so much in terms of salary, flexibility, and structure that it was going to lead to a certain build. I believe it was Gov who thought that Quentin Dempsey's ownership would be like in the upper 40, closer to 40%. Evan thought a lot lower. He thought more like 27, 28. I actually hit this one. We told you we'd review it, so I actually hit it. I said it'd be in the low 30s. So that wasn't so surprising. I don't even think the 13 hurt. It was almost like a free square. It was like Dempsey was there. But so now that you had this free square, it's like, how else are you going to build that bingo board? Because there was a lot you could do wrong. And then maybe some of it was bad luck. Like you guys can see in this lineup, we played Tyler Vaughns, who any other week we would have played him, for even week 1 when everything was unpredictable and the most volatile, we saw 4 points. We saw 13. You saw 7 targets, 13 targets. So coming off of a 13 target game, you would expect at least 5 targets, I would have thought. But okay, you get 4, okay? And you're like, well, he's got to have more than 2 points. No, only 2. The thing that really, and I don't know any other way to do this, being it's a solo show, is just to go through the thought process for myself, and then again, I'll let the gentleman comment on Friday night if they want to add to it. But Vaughn was targeted on high volume, high trusted, high quality. I guess I'd call it quality. Let's just call it quality for the sake of argument. High quality opportunities. We're talking, he was the number one guy. He was the high priority wide receiver in this game. There was one play where either he or Luis Perez was totally on the wrong page. I'm not talking like, they had missed timing or they couldn't get on the same page. They literally had the wrong diagnosis on the play. The wide receiver, Vaughn's in this case, ran completely a different route than Luis Perez was expecting. Obviously, that throws off the timing, of course, but we're not even talking about a timing in terms of fluidity kind of mistake here. We are talking about entirely different routes. So it wasn't even being on the same page or not. They were literally reading different books or even a different level language, if you will, to use that analogy. So that was just like, quite frankly, an ugly mistake that you don't normally see on a professional level between a quarterback and a wide receiver. That happened once. Vaughns was also missed in a high leverage situation, which would be considered a green zone or red zone opportunity. So those 4 targets, although they were his lowest, they were still quality targets. He was still considered the number one option up to a point. Now, unfortunately, when you're on such a bad rhythm with your quarterback, and they had been in an awesome rhythm, recently with Luis Perez, like I said, I went through it 13, 7 targets. Like even week 1, like I say, when it was the most volatile, he caught 3 passes. This is his lowest output, obviously, with 1 catch. It didn't even come until late fourth quarter, I believe. He had 0. So at 6,000, I thought this was a good spend up. It ended up being a mistake. And I can own that because this is an information game. So when it's like the draft that's coming up on Thursday, there can be so many opinions, right? But then there's only 32 opinions. We give it a lot of sex appeal, the draft. We put it in different locations. We act like it's a bigger deal. There's tradition behind it. A Nell Kiper, a Todd McShay, these different things. We'll talk about it for months. So there's podcasts dedicated to it. Move to 6, Daniel Jeremiah. There's different aspects, Peter Schrager of the NFL, and then the NFL has its own Shield announcer. Rich Eisen's known as one of the top presenters of this event. So it's become a kind of almost a holiday for football fans, or this kind of celebratory moment where it's it becomes bigger than what it is. But really, what they're doing is 32 organizations are making decisions on young men's futures. But they're being very predictive. Obviously, if they knew what was going to happen, then we wouldn't have any bust. But we know we have busts like Jamarcus Russell, and some of it is self-inflicted bust, and some of it isn't. Some of it's just opportunity and circumstances. You get drafted to a bad team, there's only so much you can do. And that happens in this league as well. Sometimes the guys are talented, they haven't been given an opportunity. And a guy like Pearson, a couple of years ago goes in the XFL, hasn't really been given an NFL chance, and shows up with the Sea Dragons. I only bring that up to say he was actually back this week. We'll talk about that more on Friday, but Pearson was back. But all I'm saying is we can have all these opinions throughout the week or throughout the months with the draft, but it comes down to 32 decision makers. That decision is obviously between the general manager and the owner, and different environmental factors or cues, if you will. But ultimately, there's going to be 32 name cards turned in, but let's not take away the moment the influence of those names being called means something. Those players, it's going to change their life. But there's going to be mistakes being made, but it's an information game, right? So you can only do your best with the information presented. Obviously, there is some forecasting and some fortune telling because although you want all your 7 round picks to happen, the odds are it's not always going to happen. I literally think we got the 1% outcome of Tyler Vaughns in this game. As many times as he was targeted, as much value as he had been perceived on his team leading up to that. Like I said, seven targets. Hell, almost 14 1 week. So that was just a bad percentage of the luck. Like we got the bad end of the luck parameter there, if you will. Kirkland, he was expensive. He was high owned. Didn't give us much leverage. But guess what? If you try to get too cute, you missed out on 18 points. And I'll tell you what, in a league that prides itself on, not having that many playmakers, not obviously that much consistency. I just talked about one of the more consistent target earners not living up to that consistency this week. Sometimes you got to be like, you know what? Kirkland might be 50% owned. He might be 48% owned. But I'm going to get so different with my stack and Dempsey. How many people will have, Dempsey and Kirkland? Probably more than you would still like, obviously. But that combination even could help offset both ownerships. It offsets the 32 and the 48% we saw. And it gives you such a consistent flow, you just eat it. Butler kind of got off to a slow start this year with AJ McCarron, but with AJ is not really known for his athleticism or his kind of ability to make plays outside of structure. Like that's not really AJ's mentality. It was going to take a few weeks for them to build chemistry, for them to build an offensive identity, for them to build a structure. But once they did, you figured they would go to their most athletic, their biggest, literally. I mean, I think he was a 5-star recruit coming out of college, out of high school. He had a productive college career. Like he was supposed to be the Mike Evans of the NFL, essentially, like this big body guy that just like could do everything athletically. It never lived up, but we're seeing it in the XFL now. So that is that's something to take note. And his opportunities are only growing, and obviously you put it in that body frame. We're talking about a Kelvin Johnson-like frame, and although AJ hasn't trusted me yet with that kind of like Matthew Stafford, Kelvin Johnson connection where it's like, oh, I'm just going to throw it up to my guy, we have seen AJ taking more and more chances with a Butler, especially in the red zone. I mean, week 1, he only saw 3 targets, and then week 2, 6, 8, 9. So each week the targets have gotten larger and larger, and the man's already like a physical freak of nature. So now we're starting to see that production match the physicality that you would expect with a target earner like that. We talked about it, building this lineup. Sure, we can eat some ownership because we just liked our safety in other spots. So we paid up for the best receiving option out of the backfield, I feel like, in this league. The Elvin Kamara, basically, of the UFL, and Ricky Preston Jr. And he got injured. I think he fumbled as well. It doesn't show a fumble, but it was really rainy. It was a really nasty game. You expected them to be up in this game. I think the weather definitely played a factor. The problem with Ricky is that they really do run a two-headed monster. We talk about the two-headed system in this league with the quarterbacks. When you have so many 2 quarterback systems or a fluidity at quarterback position, which isn't common in the NFL. But this is one of the rare featurette kind of thing with CJ Maribold that we got to be careful with the Birmingham, even though they're talented, they obviously really do divide up their touches and targets. But I'm going to be honest, I would still play hindsight being 2020. I think again We have to live with the results. And I don't mind eating crow because sometimes when you're wrong, it's okay because is there a learning lesson from it? Is there an opportunity for me to be like, okay, yeah, it's almost like preparing a really good meal and then dropping half of it on the floor. Obviously, no one wanted to dispose of your delicious, beautiful meal this way. But now that it's on the floor, how do I clean it up and preserve as much of it as I can? I think, given the workload that we have seen with his target upside as a receiver, again, we saw the lowest production, and some of that I definitely think was weather related. He's seen 10 targets so far this season, two obviously being his lowest. But even that alone, one of them was on a big screen. I want to say it was like a 14-yard screen. He was still averaging 22 yards per touch. But it's just hard when a guy like Victor is the only running back on your team for the Memphis Showboats, for example, and he's the only running back. When you have to split like Ricky has had to do with CJ, it's a harder play. And I guess that's what's so disappointing about this lineup is that we actually got the low-owned guy that we all like, the sage on this dinner that we thought was going to be so delicious at the end of the week, Sage Surratt, still continues to be consistent. Again, it's almost annoyingly, frustratingly positive. Like, as tongue-twisting as that sounds, like, he has been consistently good. He has been exactly almost robotically or animated like, to the point that it is comical to me at this point. I can't think of a better word. His yardage, his targets, his reception, his workload is essentially the same between the first 2 weeks and the last 2 weeks. He's averaged 32 yards in the first 2 weeks on different targets and everything. But I mean, the workload's pretty much the same. And then last week, we had seen pretty much the same workload. You can even look at it with this panel as well. 6 targets, 5 targets, 6 targets, 7 targets. Probably the most consistent wide receiver. Still hasn't seen the big flash upside. He came in at the lowest ownership. I hope this continues because I think the massive 15-point game is happening. And we talked about it a couple weeks ago with the Durant play that we got right when I took down the first place $50 contest. It's here's the thing. We're not always going to get it right, but when you have the information, when you have a Dempsey and he becomes available and basically a free square, it's like you got to take that information and apply it the best you can. I think we actually applied it very well in this lineup. We got very unfortunate. For example, the Stallions feel like was a great play because we had heard late the weather concerns. It was going to be a floppy game. If it was a more traditional team that we had known about, let's say, we were familiar with it. Think of the Ravens and the Steelers in this wet, swampy game. Of course, you would stack the defense with the running back. That's what we did with the Birmingham defense and the Birmingham running back. It was a nasty, slogging type game, and we actually got a defensive fumble return. We got a safety, which is some of the weirdest, unpredictable parts of the defense, like getting a safety and things like that. We didn't expect them to give up 20 points, though, essentially with 18 from the DC defenders. So that was the unfortunate part. But I thought from a structure standpoint, we structured it very well. I guess that's all I really had. You can see the lineup. I thought, like I say, Dempsey free square. You were just going to eat the ownership. I feel like you could argue with how much we were divided on it when we built it. You could argue that 32% was actually a good outcome, and we got very fortunate to get it. It's like Ricky Good, stack it with the defense that expects to be the weather concerns and the forecasting issues. Kirkland, best receiver in the league, most consistent, tons of targets in this lineup. Butler, we talked about. Sage Surratt, like I say, he's one of the most consistent guys, and I feel like if he was a wide receiver or more, this league even was more publicized, he would be higher owned. Like he has basically been the Travis Kelce, the safety valve, and most efficient for Case Cookis, who actually was injured this week. So keep in mind for that again. A shameless plug, if you will. But Friday night we'll be back with you. Let me actually transition quickly into my last point, because I don't know if the gentleman have this feeling, want to comment on this feeling, but if I get it out here, at least it's known. If they want to listen back to the playback and comment on it, they can. If you guys have thoughts, you guys know I love niche sports. UFC. I got into golf recently. Golf's only gotten bigger with the betting markets and stuff like that. So we've seen that like gambling and DFS interest has really helped with sports. I mean, it honestly has really helped golf. I think golf is taking off with young people mostly due to outright bets and the ability to bet on things. But I like all basketball. Like the playoffs is going on right now for the men's professional ranks, and unfortunately we didn't get to do a lot of basketball content because we're such big fans that like a lot of the big time marquee games this season we didn't want to go up against on a live stream setting. And then a lot of my co-hosts, we talk about Evan, Gov, Donnie, like it just so happens a lot of it is a lot of late night opportunities. That's like when we can all convene the easiest. And sometimes that's usually when TNT would do their big broadcast, or that's when, there'd be a spotlight game on ESPN, or even like, NBA is owned on the weekends, which we've never really done too many shows. But next year I do plan on doing a best ball, and I do plan on doing more basketball content because, again, I'm a fan. The thing about the Caitlin Clark WNBA that I want to highlight here, and you guys might be sick of hearing me talk about it, but again, there comes a point where if you're kind of sick of talking to me about sports, maybe just hit pause and come back to this channel later on at a different time, because that's kind of the transparency we are trying to build here. It's like when we have an opinion, when we have information, I want to share it with people. And so I have a really two good, interesting points. Actually, it allows me to rest my voice a bit because they were actually made by two podcast and sports influences I really care a great deal for. You've heard Gov talk about Pablo Torre and his new Metal Arc venture, aptly named Pablo Torre Finds Out, where he takes on what I would consider almost a comedic but journalistic integrity conversation about important topics. And he'll do that with this idea that, hey, we can have fun, we can vent back and forth, but here's the interesting kind of sidebar, kind of fascinating topic within this larger scope. So he did one we talked about it a couple of months ago now, actually with the NFL, and talked about the history of the NFL. He actually brought on a comedian, and you guys probably already laughing, thinking like, what does the comedian and sports have to do? But there's actually a lot of crossover pop culture wise. But it just so happens that this comedian is one of the biggest WNBA fans. And I thought they made a really good point, and it kind of leads me into having this larger discussion. So it's going to take me a little bit more time to present this, but let me actually present the argument to you, and I think it will make a lot more sense. And then I'll kind of comment over this first clip, and then I have another one to follow up. But I think once you start to see these clips, you'll see where I'm going here. It's important that we don't all have to be fans of the WNBA, but I think if you don't understand or appreciate, at least on some level, the newness and the hunger and the attention and why it's there, and some of it is for good and bad reasons. Some of it is sexist reasons. Let's be honest. of why people want to hate on the WNBA. Some people want to hate on it because they've always hated on it because they don't want to give women equal footing. And, some of what women had to fight for in the even high school or collegiate level was because of Section 9 and women's equality. And had that not happened, who knows if we'd even have professional basketball on the level we do. And now that it has seen success, it's almost like people have been, beaten over the head with it. And it's kind of annoying a bit for me as a hardcore fan because it's like, well, I want new fans and I want people to be engaged. And like, obviously with any kind of activism or any kind of like newness or, hey, this sport is new, or hey, gambling has taken on prop bets, or they've taken on this new angle with how to enjoy sports. All of that's going to kind of have this, even if it's like an excitement, it's like a mystery, it's a nervousness. Like I remember telling my parents, hey, I think I can make maybe not a living gambling, but I think I can make a disposable income. They were a bit nervous. You kind of get that gambling backdoor feel, like, oh, it's a dark room, it's a poker, it's you're dealing with like there's all these stereotypes basically that get portrayed on you when actually DraftKings and those entities are actually ran very well, and even to a point where they're ran so well that it's not at all shady or any kind of thing like that. So I want to make this point and then follow up kind of with the opposite, the juxtaposed position, and then leave you with one last commentary. So let's get onto this clip, and I'll comment quickly, and then we'll get on to the second clip.
Finally start giving a shit about the thing that you have been loving for decades.
Everyone knows it's like try this food, it's really great. And your friend's like, no, I know I wouldn't like. And then 5 years later, they're like, I tried this greatest sandwich I've ever had. Like the one I told you for 10 years to try. Like, what's like the proper behavior of a newcomer? The people frustrating me are not the people who are loving something. That's incredible. There's no bigger tell on yourself than saying, I've never seen that before. I love Caitlin Clark, but if you don't know who Maya Moore is and you know Caitlin Clark is, that's a tell on yourself. I'm not getting in those fights. You don't want to be that person. You want to be welcoming to anyone who loves anything, but you're just not going to avoid the negativity and you're not going to avoid the toxicity because it gets clicks, it gets views, it gets people who want attention. That is not unique to women's basketball. It's just women's basketball is right now, I think, the most singularly interesting area to study of what social media does.
So that's an interesting point. I hope you guys really go on down to that. I'm not saying that there isn't sexist people that will use WNBA and Caitlin Clark's fame incorrectly. And I think in my second clip, you'll see that that's exactly what happened in some cases. But there's also an excitement because there's a chance that not only women's sports, but a lot of niche sports will get opportunities. Netflix getting into the Jake Paul, Mike Tyson, boxing. Even you could say that's an exhibition, that's a circus, but Netflix taking on that streaming service, first deep dive into live sports on a high level where they're expecting a big audience. Like, yeah, sure, it's still women's basketball, and maybe you're a huge fan, and all this extra attention on a shooter like Caitlin Clark, like the comedian made the point, you might argue that Sue Bird was better than Caitlin Clark, or, Maya Moore, to her point, is the best historic women's, professional basketball player to this point. Did tremendous social justice work too. So like a great character woman. But that's where she's almost saying the same point. It's not that we have to pick our favorite food, or that I haven't been on this podcast before, because I have, telling you that women's basketball is important. There is also a pop culture moment where it's like, oh, my friend is now going to pay attention to this because it's popular. That's cool too. Like sometimes to engage my nephew, for example, it has to be cool. It has to have kind of this it has to have this kind of bravado or this kind of attention to get you interested, and then you fall in love with the techniques. Maybe for you it was Kobe Bryant, or it was Michael Jordan, or it was the high flying act of Vince Carter, and it was that kind of showmanship that got you into the sport. But then once you're in, you fell in love with the tactician of Tim Duncan, or you fell in love with, just how awesome and simplistic that Joker is, because, Nikola doesn't dunk a lot, but fundamentally he is probably the best passing big man of all time. And he's still playing moderately at a championship level still. So I don't want to be that guy that's like, even though I have great intentions, I want women's basketball to do well. I want MMA to do well. I'm not going to tell you to watch PFF because they signed one of the best Irish fighters this week, or British fighters this week, or Venom Page is exciting and he's over at the UFC now. And like, if you're a big fan, you've known about MVP for a while, but it took the UFC to put him on a different platform. That platform is the truth sometimes, but people can use that platform incorrectly. And I want to point that out with this last clip here. And it was the Doyle thing with the reporting was just terrible. And I want to play this clip just so you'll hear it. And then we'll make one last comment, but here we go.
0.5 million people watched the WNBA draft. If we need another data point to talk about how popular women's basketball and Caitlin Clark in particular are. Then Clark has her introductory press conference in Indianapolis.
Sorry, I forgot to mention this. This is a different podcast. This is the Press Box with Brian Curtis. And I really like this one. It's a kind of journalistic approach to pop culture, to politics, to sports, and the intersections. And he's going to talk about Doyle here really soon, and how Doyle kind of used this Indianapolis Star kind of journalistic integrity to kind of almost embarrassingly, I will say embarrassingly, very sexist kind of undertones to this discussion. So I'm going to go back here because I forgot to properly introduce it again. Thanks for letting me use this 3-minute clip for fair use purposes. But this is Brian Curtis of the Press Box. Again, I don't think you would mind. He's a big journalist guy, obviously big supporter of podcasts like this one. So let's just hear this clip, and then I'll make one last comment.
For 2.5 million people watched the WNBA draft. If we need another data point to talk about how popular women's basketball and Caitlin Clark in particular are. Then Clark has her introductory press conference in Indianapolis. And Greg Doyle, who is a columnist for the Indy Star, gets the microphone. He introduces himself by making a heart shape with his hands, which I'm doing to you in the Zoom right now. This is how I welcome all guests to the press.
And I'm doing
box.
that to you.
Thank you very much, Derek. And then Greg Doyle says this.
Hi, Caitlin. Greg Doyle, Indy Star. Real quick, I'll do this.
You like that?
I like that you're here. I like
Yeah,
that you're here.
I do that at my family after every game, so.
Okay,
Very
well,
cool.
let's start doing it to me and we'll get along just fine. So, question is,
What did you make of that exchange?
My toes curled in absolute deathly embarrassment on behalf of every single person in that room, including myself, not even in that room. I mean, just, I think, I know that this is one of your bugaboos, so I'm going to give you the floor in just a second. I think most of these press conferences are one shitty question after another. I'm not exactly sure why the institution of the press conference, and certainly the halftime interview, still exists the way it exists. But certainly, Mr. Doyle is not doing anything positive to resuscitate the reputation of this institution, because this was an embarrassment from top to bottom, and I'm embarrassed for him. My toes are still curled.
I'm something of a connoisseur, as you mentioned, of these particular exchanges. I've never seen anything like this. Nothing exactly like that. And you're right, there is a just endemic level of shittiness, but we've gone up the power rankings of shittiness here.
I think that's a very good point. And let me just make that really quickly, and we'll continue the clip. It's only a few more minutes. Is there a racist undertone in sports? Has there been in baseball with, Jackie Robinson? Has there been in basketball with the introduction of like, oh, you're dressing like a gangster because you like Allen Iverson, or hey, we're gonna clean up this image because I'm David Stern and I gotta have the Stern image of professional basketball, and we have to wear suit and ties, and Allen cannot wear any gold chains. He cannot like flaunt his cultural appropriation the way he wants to. And that's it, because then he doesn't present a successful African American with a different perspective. And like you could say, oh, like I don't think that's a good look for a professional, or I don't think that's like the way I would do it. Conserve myself. But like when we don't have when we don't give appropriate melting pot discussions to, hey, you have a different style, literally for the NBA's case, or you have a different way of communicating with your family. Hey, that's cool. There's something unique. There's something different about that. To use a heart symbol that she shares with her family, that kind of like, yes, it's caught on. They've commercialized it. Like it's not all wholesome. Like I'm not saying it. She hasn't profited off of some of it, just like how Allen Iverson or Russell Westbrook even now has his own clothing line. That doesn't mean that like, oh, they're somehow not professional because they don't show up in a suit and tie. The idea that there's this undertone that she's a woman, like he wouldn't say that to a man. And sure, maybe he's not a homosexual, or maybe he has a certain attraction to Caitlin Clark because she's a woman, because it's a power woman structure, and he's excited that women's basketball, that the Fever or even the Colts, or maybe because he covered the Colts a lot. He covered the Colts. He's covered, Indiana sports. So maybe there's more attention on the Colts or Indianapolis than there has been since Peyton Manning. So maybe he's overexcited. But the power ranking, as Curtis was saying, of just cringe, like weird sexist energy is really, it's unfortunate as a fan. As a man of modern times, in my own beliefs politically, it's disappointing. But even if you don't have the same political views and you think I'm going a bit too far here, it's unprofessional at the very least. So let me continue this and you'll see how bad it gets. But like you said, I just thought from a professional standpoint, at least, it's very uncomfortable.
We really have reached a new thing, because somebody texted me this yesterday and said, usually when there's an awkward sports press conference moment, or at any press conference, it's because you're trying to get at an uncomfortable truth. You're asking a question that maybe the person doesn't want to answer and you assume they don't want to answer. Greg Doyle was introducing himself. This is not even asking a question. He's saying hello and is unable to say hello.
Right, that's exactly it. So let's assume that you wanted to have a personal conversation, or you wanted to get really intimate about something. A lot of times with my disability, someone will be curious. They'll say, like, oh, what disability do you have? Or, I want to be a helpful figure for you. I want to be a good Samaritan, those type of things. And they'll be like, oh, I feel so bad for you. What disability you have? That's totally appropriate. It is a bit uncomfortable as a disabled man who has full cognitive range. I'll be honest with you, when people act like I am mentally retarded or mentally at a lack when I'm not. And I don't mean that like the derogatory way. I mean that in like the medical way. Like people assume because of the way I look, there's a certain thing, and like some of that is stigma and culture, and I get it. Like I have to fight that. And it's not they're fighting against me. It's just the era or the bubble that we live in. Sometimes to expand or to grow, we have to live with this uncomfortable truth, as he mentioned. Like I would be totally illegitimate to say like, oh, women's basketball deserves to be as popular as the men this year because we have Caitlin Clark. So Charles Barkley and Shaq should do almost a TNT-like broadcast. And like that would be negligent for me to suggest. But to have the conversation whether I think Caitlin Clark could influence the WNBA to make it a positive, experience for Turner or HBO or Amazon Prime or whoever takes over and like makes this the next big jump. Maybe Caitlin Clark's kind of fascination allows you to see again a Paige Beckers next year, really take off. Or maybe, people will realize, oh, there's a lot of good young athletes like we saw with the All-Star Weekend, Steph Curry and Sabrina. Women in this sport exist all over the place. And you can have personal, emotional connections, in all sports. That's that's part of the reason I have enjoyed sports, because I couldn't play it on a physicality level, but I could talk about it. I could be a journalist. I could be a coach. There was a lot of different inflection points in which I could interact with sports. And so that's why this is probably sensitive to me. But there are truths, or there are situations that you would have with someone, and when you gain that trust, that you wouldn't have when you haven't. And the problem is Greg Doyle went to the point where it got uncomfortable, because instead of building that trust with reporter and sports, broadcaster or presenter, he presented a uncomfortable, rapid pace of, hey, I'm going to go to this place and make it awkward for everyone involved. Oh, and by the way, I'm introducing myself. Like, that's the thing, is like, there's an art to introducing yourself, and there are boundaries that you set when you introduce yourself that you wouldn't cross on the first encounter. That's a problem. But let me just finish this last few minutes of it. We'll wrap the show up. But thank you guys for joining me. Again, we'll be back on Friday, but let me finish up here if you have any interest in fairness of the story.
Without completely tripping over his question and just falling down face first in front of America. Reminder, he knew that this was televised.
It's interesting to think that journalism is the struggle to reach uncomfortable truths. And in this case, Mr. Doyle did an amazing journalism, because he arrived at the uncomfortable truth that he has a crush on Caitlin Clark and revealed it in the most horrifyingly embarrassing way. Once again, look, I think sports journalism is absolutely fantastic, but this institution is not the way to do it. I don't know why we're asking questions of people in exactly this way. And certainly, if it's just going to be a bunch of middle-aged male journalists finding obscure ways to tell younger elite female athletes they have crushes on them, we need to do away with the enterprise entirely.
One more uncomfortable truth revealed, which I think is slightly different than what we're talking about, but perhaps related in a way. When you hear the phraseology there, start doing it to me, meaning the heart hand gesture, and we'll be able to get along just fine. Boy, that is the whiff of, you're the new athlete in town, but I'm the big dog columnist here at the Indy Star. And during your career here in Indianapolis, you and I are going to have to find a way to get along, or I'm going to have to tell my readers of the Indy Star some uncomfortable stuff about you.
And that's the problem, is even if that wasn't his intention, and that read-in or that power struggle wasn't his intention, by setting up such an awkward, such a fumbling, sexist-like comment, it opens up the door for this kind of criticism that, yes, maybe misleading, it may be an assumption to jump to, but people are going to connect the dots when those dots are already weirdly correlated. When see, that's the thing, is when it's almost like a live wire of electricity. We can all say it's dangerous, but if it happens and then you act negligent or you act immature around that wire, that's where real danger happens. Because if a live wire falls down and that electricity is sparking, and you have a safe distance and you wait for safety protocols and law enforcement and different things like that to happen, and it follows a sequence of a emergency evacuation, you're fine. It's when you take these easy comical jabs of inappropriateness that you find out things are not always funny, and then people start to question your morality rightfully, and we find some uncomfortable things about that as well. So let me just finish up with Mr. Curtis here, and thank our participatory people. Thank you guys for joining me, because I know these solo shows aren't easy, but let's just finish this up one last time. Here we go.
That was perhaps the case with powerful sports newspaper columnists of 1984, 1974. We could go back a bit. That's not the case now.
That's a great point. And maybe I need to go back and look at the clip, because when I first saw it, I thought it felt uncomfortably familiar in the way that I'm getting at. But you're right. Maybe the better way to see it is as some kind of weird attempt to make a joking power play. You're the new kid in town. I'm the established sports reporter at the local newspaper. As long as you essentially give me the gestural bribe of throwing me a couple hand hearts, then I'll write nice things about you. Maybe that's what he was trying to do, is sort of demonstrate some kind of power play over Caitlin Clark. But look, it was obviously an absurd fail. I think by the time you and the producer sent me the tweet, the post, whatever it's called, it had been seen 35 million times on Twitter itself. I mean, just an epic face rock.
It was doing Caitlin Clark numbers, but on Twitter. Yeah. And let's not be too charitable about accepting my interpretation there, because all of these things can be true. I'm not in the mood to be charitable right now. This story.
So that's a very valuable point. And to come full circle just quickly on the UFL, I've heard, oh, I would watch it if they had better stars, or I'd watch it if they had more NFL names. It's like, it's okay if you're an NFL fan and you're excited for the draft in a couple days and you don't want to watch the UFL. It's okay. It's perfectly fine. But there are some shitty communities out there that just shit on this product because it doesn't have recognizable names, or because they perceive these guys to be lesser than or not as professional than, like, any of these other wide receivers. But we've seen plenty of individuals and characteristics in the NFL we don't like. Deshaun Watson, Antonio Brown. But then we've also seen great stories of, tremendous strength and tremendous, volunteering, kindness. Matthew Stafford, Jason Kelsey comes to mind. Lane Johnson on the Eagles actually comes to mind as well. There's a lot of great humanitarians in the league. And so you can pick and choose these different arguments, but I think some of this underlying stuff is definitely there. So I wanted to take that opportunity to lay that case out. Whether you agree with it or not, you can definitely understand that some people in this community have used sports for the right and wrong, and that will continue. But at least I have to speak my truth. And whether that comes with an audience of 35 or 30,000 or eventually a million, and we win the milli before we even have a milli views, that's okay as well. Because I'm doing it with the people I love. I'm doing it with the gentlemen that I care about. Speaking of these gentlemen, they will be back with me on Friday night. You guys see the sub gold on there. I'm very excited because this is actually incorrect. I believe we have 111 subscribers now. All we're asking for is 300, but really the case is, then we get to 300, we want 600, then we want 900. We're always going to be hungry for more people, but there's also a responsibility with those more people. We won with Durant, and it helped our community, even though our community was small. People like Juno saw great profit from that. Just a few names, a few guys who follow us. When we hit that 300 number, we're going to try to get bigger and better production and better lighting. And, when we first started the show, we didn't have Evan on here, on a weekly basis. And we were able to cultivate that relationship. So as we grow, this channel is going to grow. The community will still stay transparent. That will be a keystone for me, is transparency and honesty. And maybe you've turned this podcast off because it wasn't for you. That's okay as well. You can digest this in segments. You could say, I'm just here for the review show. So here it is. I'm just here for this. But this long running thing just allows it to be transparent. It shows you that there's no edits. There's no thrills. There's no frills, but there's growth. And once we have seen that growth, then we can go from there. So we're trying to get to 300. One subscribe adds up to those 300 if enough people do it. So we appreciate that time. I appreciate you guys. Good night. Take care. See you on Friday.